The hum of the energy field was the only sound in Hannah's cell. It was a low, steady vibration that traveled through the floor and up into her bones. She sat perfectly still on the hard bench, trying to separate the different tones within it. There was the main hum, a deeper thrum from somewhere below, and a high, almost silent whine from the ceiling. To anyone else, it was just noise. To Hannah, it was a map. She was listening to the station's heart. A soft chime echoed in the room. A section of the wall opposite the energy field shimmered and became transparent. On the other side was a small communication booth. Her uncle, Kim Min-soo, was there. He looked older than she remembered, his face tired, his hair more gray than black, but his eyes were the same, sharp, kind, and full of a quiet intelligence. A guard stood behind him, watching. "Hannah," Min-soo said, his voice slightly distorted by the speaker. "Uncle," she replied. Her own voice sounded small. She wanted to cry, to scream that it wasn't fair. But she saw the warning in his eyes. They were being monitored. "I have spoken with the human envoy," Min-soo said, his words careful and formal. "They are making appeals. But the council's legal process is complex." He paused, choosing each word like a tool. "You must be strong. You must use everything you know. Remember who you are." He leaned a little closer to the screen, his voice dropping. "Do you remember working on the old Gwangju freighter? When its core was failing?" Hannah blinked. That was years ago when she was 15. He had taken her on a repair job. The ship's plasma core had been unstable, threatening to crack. "I remember," she said slowly. "Do you remember what we did? We didn't fight the break. We listened for it. We found the resonance. The ship's heart spoke its own weakness." He held her gaze. "Everything has a frequency, Hannah, a truth it cannot hide. Even the strongest shell. You just have to listen for the break." The guard behind Min-soo shifted, a clear sign the conversation was ending. "They are allowing me this one call," Min-soo said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't show. "Be brave, little engineer. Listen." The screen went dark, returning to solid wall. Hannah sat back, her mind racing. His words were not just comfort. They were a lesson, a reminder of a specific skill. On the Gwangju freighter, the core hadn't needed more power. It had been vibrating at a wrong frequency, shaking itself apart. They had stabilized it by introducing a counter-resonance, a precise opposite vibration, through the main power conduit. Listen for the break. The ship's heart. Her eyes traveled around her cell. This wasn't a ship. It was a space station, the Council's judicial heart, Eternum Lex. But the principle was the same. All centralized power systems had a core. And all cores had a resonant frequency, a vibration they were most sensitive to. Find that frequency and you could, what? She wasn't sure, but it was the only tool she had. She stood and walked to the energy field. She raised a hand near it, not touching. The static made the fine hairs on her arm stand up. She closed her eyes and focused past the fear. She heard the main hum again. It was a G-sharp, she thought, or close to it. Very softly, she began to hum herself. She matched the pitch of the field, feeling it in her throat. Then, she slowly slid the pitch up, then down, listening for a change in the field's sound. First, nothing. Just the steady, oppressive hum. She tried again, thinking of the deeper thrum from below. The station's power core. She hummed lower, searching. Her voice was weak, but sound was vibration, and vibration traveled. As her voice hit a particular low C, something changed. The light of the energy field flickered, just for a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost invisible shudder in the air. Hannah's eyes snapped open. Her heart hammered. She had found something, a sympathetic vibration. The station's power system was sensitive to that frequency. A different sound interrupted her. The hiss of the main door deactivating. The energy field vanished, and guardrail entered. He carried a tray of food, a bland paste and water. He placed it on a small shelf that extended from the wall. "Your meal," he said. His voice was neutral, metallic, filtered through a helmet. Hannah didn't move from the field. This station, she said quietly. It's powered by a primary fusion core, right? Probably a Mark 7 or something similar. Rael stopped and looked at her. His cybernetic eye lens whirred softly, focusing. That is not relevant to you. It's just mechanics, Hannah said, shrugging, trying to seem harmless, curious. I studied systems. The harmonics must be incredible. It must have a very stable resonant frequency to keep everything running. A single note. For a long moment, Rael was silent. Then he said, "It is stable. It is protected. Do not waste your thoughts on it. Think of your soul, human. You have little time left." He turned and left. The field buzzed back to life. But he had answered. He had confirmed it. The station had a single, stable resonant frequency. The key to its stability was also, potentially, a key to its weakness. Just like the Guangzhou freighter. Just like the Xylos crystal core. A cold realization settled over her. The crystal on Xylos was an energy storage device, ancient and powerful. What if it hadn't just broken? What if it had been destabilized? If someone had introduced the wrong frequency into it, they could have made it shatter. Someone with access. Someone who knew systems. Someone like Judge Quark, who lived and ruled from a station run by the same principles. She looked at the food paste, no longer hungry. Her uncle hadn't just told her how to fight. He had pointed her toward the truth. The station's heart held a secret, and she was going to listen until it spoke. Time in the cell had no meaning. Hannah slept in short, uneasy bursts. The constant hum was always there. It was in her dreams. She dreamt of the Xylos crystal, not as a dead thing, but as a singing, living object. In her dream, its song was beautiful, until a wrong note was introduced. A harsh, grinding frequency that made the crystal scream and then explode into silent dust. She woke up with her own hum in her throat. She had been humming in her sleep. The note was the same low C that had made the energy field flicker. They came for her twice. The first time it was a medical droid. It scanned her with cold blue lights, checking her physical health for the execution. She was a specimen, being prepared for disposal. She said nothing, just watched its mechanical arms. She listened to the tiny whirring motors in its joints, each with their own little pitch. The second time it was a different official. This one was robed with a solemn face. He explained the procedure of neural disintegration. It would be quick. It would be painless. It was, he said, a merciful method. Hannah asked if she could have a data pad to write a final letter to her uncle. The request was denied. Information flow was controlled, he said. She was a security risk until the end. When he left, Hannah placed both her palms flat on the smooth floor. The station's vibration was stronger here. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly. She wasn't just listening anymore. She was trying to understand the structure of the sound. The main hum was the loudest, but underneath it, like a river under ice, was a more powerful thrum. The core, and woven through it were thousands of other tiny threads, the sounds of life support, of computers, of doors opening and closing far away. It was a symphony of machinery, and every symphony had a conductor, a central rhythm that everything else followed. She needed to find that core rhythm, not just the note, but its exact pulse. She had nothing to write with, nothing to record. She had to use her own memory. She started to tap her fingers softly against the floor, matching what she felt. Thrum, 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 thrum. It was a pattern. A steady, powerful beat with a tiny skip in the middle. Like a heartbeat with a mild arrhythmia. A Mark 7 fusion core was nearly perfect, but nothing was ever perfect. That tiny skip was a flaw, a weakness. It was the break her uncle had told her to listen for. The door hissed again. Hannah pulled her hands back and stood up, expecting another official or guard. It was Observer Yull. The soft-furred diplomat stood on the other side of the energy field. His large eyes were wide with what looked like genuine sorrow. He carried a small, woven bag. "Hannah," he said, his voice gentle, "I have been granted permission to offer you spiritual comfort before the end, according to your human customs." Hannah said nothing. She just watched him. She remembered him speaking up in the chamber. He had tried, Yul looked over his shoulder nervously. The guard outside, visible through the open door, was looking the other way. Moving quickly, Yul reached into his bag. He didn't pull anything out. Instead, he pressed his hand and the bag flat against the energy field. There was a brief spark. A small, shaped piece of material no bigger than a coin slipped through the field's frequency gap. A gap meant for small food trays, not contraband. It fell silently to the floor at Hannah's feet. "Your uncle?" Yul whispered. The words rushed and barely audible. "He is a good man. He reminded many of your father's work. Look at this when you are alone. Do not let the system see." He then stepped back and spoke in a louder, formal tone. "I hope you find peace, child." He bowed his head and walked away, his robes swishing, the door sealed. Hannah waited, her heart pounding. After a full minute, she knelt and picked up the object. It was a data chip, sleek and cool. But how could she read it? She had no device. Then she remembered. Her left forearm just below the elbow. A small, barely visible scar. When she was 16, she and Minsu had been working on a deep space relay. A piece of shielding had snapped, and a fragment had sliced her arm. The medical fix had included a simple subcutaneous data port, used for direct machine interfacing during complex repairs. The tool. She had never had it removed. She pressed the chip against the scar. There was a faint tingle as it connected to the old port. A stream of information flooded directly into her mind's eye, not as words, but as images, schematics, and logs. She saw energy transfer orders, signed with Judge Kvork's official symbol. She saw technical readouts from the Xylos crystal core, showing its energy levels being secretly drained over months. The logs showed it was being siphoned to a private account, to a location that matched Kvork's personal estate on his homeworld. The final report stated the core was at critical instability. The last entry was an order to falsify the security logs, to create the gap that placed Hannah alone in the chamber. The crystal hadn't broken because she touched it. It had shattered because it was hollowed out, made brittle by theft. She was not a vandal. She was a witness who had been set up to die, to cover up the crime of a council judge. The data ended. Hannah opened her eyes. The hum of the station felt different. It was no longer just a sound. It was the sound of the system that had condemned her, a system built and controlled by the very creature who had broken its own laws. She looked at the energy field. She knew its frequency. She knew the core's resonant pulse. And now she knew the truth. The anger she had been suppressing rose up, hot and clear. But it wasn't a wild anger. It was a focused one. She was an engineer. She had been given a broken system, and she was going to find a way to make it tell the truth to everyone. The truth was a cold, heavy stone inside Lee Hannah. She sat on the bench, holding the data chip so tightly its edges pressed into her palm. Judge Kvork hadn't just made a mistake. He had planned this. He had stolen until the ancient crystal broke, and he needed someone to blame. A human, a young one from a species no one respected, was the perfect choice. She thought about showing the chip to Guardrail when he next came. But she stopped herself. Would he believe her? The chip came from Yul, who was now risking his own safety. The data could be called a fake, a human trick. Kvork was a high judge. His word against hers would mean nothing. She needed more than truth. She needed proof that everyone could see and hear. Her mind went back to the vibrations. The station's hum was the key. It was the sound of power, and power was what Kvork had stolen. She had the core's resonant frequency, that low C with the tiny skip in its pulse. If she could make the station itself react to that frequency, somehow, if she could connect the theft to the judge in a way no one could ignore, she needed to test her idea. But she was in a cell with nothing but her own voice. When Guardrail brought the next meal, she was ready. She didn't talk about the chip or the judge. She talked about sound. "Your armor," Hannah said, as he placed the tray down. "The plating. Is it ceramic composite?" Rail paused. "It is." "Why?" "When you walk, the plates don't clank. They must be bonded with a vibration dampening field. A smart system, probably tuned to the same base frequency as the station's gravity, to minimize noise." She was speaking his language now, the language of systems and function. He looked at her, his head tilted slightly. Your observation is correct. It is for stealth operations. My point is, Hannah continued, everything here is connected by frequency. This whole station is a single, tuned instrument. She gestured to the walls. The core sets the note. Everything else, even your armor, has to sing along, or there's discord. Rael was silent for a long moment. You find this interesting? Now? I find mechanics interesting always, she said softly. It's the only thing that makes sense. Machines have rules. They don't lie. If something breaks, there's always a reason. A cause. She looked directly at his helmeted face. Unlike people, something in her tone seemed to reach him. He did not leave immediately. The execution chamber, he said, his voice low. It is directly below the main judicial hall. It draws power straight from the core through a dedicated conduit. It is the most stable room on the station. Nothing can interfere with its function. He said it like a fact, but it felt like a warning. After he left, Hannah processed his words. The most stable room. That was important. Stability meant it was perfectly tuned. And something perfectly tuned is most vulnerable to its exact resonant frequency. A plan began to form in her mind. It was a desperate, dangerous plan. It required her to get to that chamber. It required her to be near that power conduit. And it required her to produce a very specific sound at a very specific moment. But how? She couldn't just hum. The sound would be too weak. She looked at her meal tray. It was a simple, flat sheet of a durable polymer. She picked it up. She held it by the edge and flicked it with her finger. It gave a dull, low thud. Not right. An idea came. She went to the sink and ran a little water. Carefully, she wet the edge of the tray. Then, she pressed the wet edge firmly against the smooth wall of her cell. She dragged it down slowly. A horrible, sharp noise of vibrating polymer filled the cell. It was awful. But more importantly, the wall was acting as a giant speaker, amplifying the vibration. The energy field in front of her flashed and buzzed angrily. She stopped. That was too high-pitched. But the principle worked. The station structure could carry and amplify vibration. She needed something metal, something that could hold a tune. Her eyes fell on the frame of her bench. It was bolted to the floor. She knelt and felt along the underside. One of the bolts had a slight lip, a place where a tool would grip. She couldn't turn it with her fingers, but she didn't need to turn it. She took her water cup, a small, hard plastic cylinder. She struck the lip of the bolt with the rim of the cup. Ting! A clear, metallic note rang out. It was higher than the core's frequency. She tried again, hitting it at a different angle with less force. Tonk. Lower. Closer. She spent what felt like hours, her world shrinking to the bolt, the cup, and the sound. She adjusted her grip, the angle of the strike, the force. Her wrist ached. Her ears rang. Finally, she struck a precise, soft tap at just the right spot. Doom! A deep, almost inaudible sound resonated. Not just in the air, but through the floor. The low C. It was pure, and it hung in the air for a second longer than it should have. The main lights in her cell dimmed, just a fraction, for a heartbeat. She had done it. She had found her tool. A plastic cup and a bolt. She could produce the core's resonant frequency. Now she had to wait. She had to get to the execution chamber. And she had to find a way to make the station itself tell the truth, using the very power the judge had corrupted. She sat on the floor, the cup held tightly in her hand, listening to the hum of the machine that was going to try to kill her. She was no longer just listening for the break. She was holding the note that would cause it. The sound of marching boots echoed down the hall. It was time. The door to Lee Hannah's cell slid open with a final hiss. For guards stood there, not just Rael. They were larger, clad in heavier armor, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They did not speak. Guard Rael stepped forward. He held a set of thin, glowing binders. "You must wear these," he said, his voice flat. Hannah stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she kept her back straight. She held her hands out. The binders snapped shut around her wrists. They were cool and hummed with a low energy, a different frequency than the station. They would stop her from moving her hands apart, but her fingers were still free. She slowly closed her right hand, making a loose fist, hiding the small, hard plastic cup she had palmed from the floor. The guards formed a box around her and led her out. The corridors of Eternum Lex were grand and terrifying. The ceilings were high, arched, and decorated with swirling symbols of 100 species. Through giant viewports, the darkness of space was dotted with cold stars and the distant lights of ships. Beings of all shapes and sizes moved through the halls. Some stopped to stare. Others looked away quickly. She was a curiosity, a condemned thing on its last walk. They did not take her to a prison transport. They took her upward, via a silent lift, into the heart of the station. The air grew even colder. The decor became more severe, all polished black stone and glowing blue lines of light. They arrived at the Grand Judicial Hall. It was the same vast, circular room where she had been sentenced. But now it was full. Every council member's balcony was occupied. Silent, shadowy figures watched from the dark. The central floor, where she stood, was bathed in a blinding white spotlight. And there, on his high bench of dark stone, was Judge Quark. He looked larger here, more powerful. His shell gleamed under the lights. His 4 arms were resting on the bench, his pincers looking sharp and cruel. He watched her walk in, his dark eyes unreadable that a heavy silence filled the room. It was a silence of ceremony, of ritual. This was not just an execution. It was a performance. A lesson. Quark's clicking voice broke the quiet. Lee Hanna of Earth, you stand before the gathered council for the carrying out of lawful sentence. Do you have any final words? This was her only chance to speak to them all. Her mouth was dry. She could feel the data chip in her other hand, the one pressed against her scar. She could shout the truth, but words were weak. They would just be more human noise. She lifted her head. Her voice, when it came, was clear and carried across the silent hall. I have only this to say. You call this justice, but a machine built on a lie will always break. You should listen to the break when it comes. A murmur went through the balconies. Her words made no sense to them. They sounded like the rambling of a scared child. Quark made a sharp, dismissive click. Empty words from a chaotic mind. The sentence will proceed. Take her to the chamber. The guards turned her away from the benches. At the far end of the hall was a large, round door, made of a bronze-colored metal. As they approached, it spiraled open without a sound, revealing a smaller room beyond. The execution chamber. It was perfectly circular and utterly bare. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made of the same seamless, polished silver metal. In the very center of the room was a single, plain column, about as tall as Hannah's waist. On top of it was a complicated array of crystal rods and glowing coils. The neural disintegrator, a single, thick cable, as wide as her leg, emerged from the floor and connected to the base of the column. This was the direct power conduit guardrail had mentioned. It pulsed with a soft blue light. The hum in here was deeper, purer, stronger than anywhere else. It vibrated in her teeth. This was the heart of the machine. The guards led her to the column. They unlocked her binders. One guard pointed to a marked circle on the floor in front of the device. Stand there. Do not move. Hannah stepped into the circle. She could feel the thrum of power through the soles of her thin shoes. She glanced at the power conduit. It was close, only 2 steps away. But a faint, shimmering energy field surrounded it. A visible warning not to touch. She looked at her hands. She still held the plastic cup, hidden against her palm. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure the machine could hear it. From the grand hall, Judge Quark's voice boomed through hidden speakers. Activate the sequence. Let the galaxy see that order is maintained. A low whine began to build from the crystal rods above her. They started to glow, a harsh, bright white. The sound climbed higher, drowning out the deep hum of the core. It was a painful sound, designed to overwhelm the mind. This was it. She had seconds. Hannah dropped to her knees, not in prayer, but in action. She ignored the glowing device above her. She swung her arm back and with all her strength, she threw the plastic cup, not at the machine, but at the shimmering energy field around the power conduit. The cup, tumbling end over end, passed through the field. There was a loud zap and a shower of sparks. The cup vaporized instantly, but in that instant, as the field reacted to the intrusion, its frequency spiked and scrambled. And in that same instant, Hannah pressed the data chip in her left hand hard against the scar on her arm. She focused every bit of her will not on accessing it but on sending it. She used the chip like a transmitter, aiming its data straight at the open, scrambled power conduit, hoping its raw information would ride the surge of power back to its source, the station's central core and every system connected to it. The whine of the disintegrator reached its peak. A beam of white light began to descend from the crystals toward her head. And then, every screen in the Grand Judicial Hall, every monitor, every data panel in the chamber itself, flickered blue and went blank for 1 second. When the image returned, it was not the execution feed. It was Judge Kvork's energy transfer orders. It was the logs of the draining Xylos crystal. It was his signature, clear and undeniable, authorizing theft and fraud. The data was on every screen, for every member of the Galactic Council to see. For 1 long second, there was only silence in the Grand Judicial Hall. The image on every screen, the damning data, the proof of theft, hung in the air. The galaxy's most powerful beings stared, their minds processing the betrayal. Then, chaos erupted. The hall filled with the clicks, shrieks, and roars of 100 different languages, all shouting in shock and anger. The spotlight on the execution chamber feed flickered wildly. Inside the silver room, the white beam of the disintegrator stopped, frozen just a hand's width from the top of Hannah's head. The machine's high-pitched whine dropped to a confused, shuddering groan. The system was in conflict. Its primary orders said to execute, but its core programming had just received data labeling the authorizing judge a criminal. Hannah didn't move. She stayed on her knees, her lungs burning, waiting for the beam to finish its job. She heard the shouts from the hall. She had done it. The truth was out. Then, a new sound cut through the noise. It was a raw, furious screech of grinding shell. It came from the main hall, broadcast through the speakers on the feed. Hannah saw Judge Kvork surge up from his bench. His huge body trembled with rage. "Lies!" he boomed, his voice cracking with fury. "A human trick, a corruption of the system. Execute her now." But the system hesitated. The guards in the execution chamber looked at each other. Unsure. Kvork saw the hesitation. He saw his life, his power, crumbling because of the girl in the silver room. Rage consumed his reason. He would not let a machine's confusion ruin him. He would do it himself with a powerful thrust of his legs. He leaped from his high bench. He landed on the main floor of the hall with a heavy thud that shook the cameras. He began to charge toward the open execution chamber door, his 4 pincers snapping, his shell plates clattering. In the chamber, the guards finally moved. "Intruder! Secure the prisoner!" one shouted, stepping between Hannah and the door. But they were not prepared for a judge. Kvork barreled through the spiraling door, knocking one guard aside. His dark eyes were fixed on Hannah, still kneeling by the power conduit. "You insect! You think your tricks save you? I will break you with my own hands." The other guards froze, caught between protecting the prisoner and defying a judge. Hannah scrambled to her feet. The beam above her sputtered. The machine was still trying to decide. Kvork was almost upon her, a mountain of rage and sharp edges. She had no weapon. She had only the deep, pure hum of the room and the knowledge in her bones. She didn't run from the power conduit. She ran toward it, placing her body between the furious judge and the thick, pulsing cable. "The station knows what you did," she yelled, her voice small against his rage. "The core knows. The core is mine." Kvork roared, swinging a massive pincer at her head. Hannah ducked. The pincer slammed into the shimmering energy field around the power conduit. The field, still unstable from the cup's impact, flashed a violent purple. The shock made Quark bellow in pain and stagger back. But he wasn't finished. He was trapped, and his only way out was to silence her. He lunged again, this time lower, aiming to crush her against the silver wall. Hannah saw it coming. She had one chance. She remembered the tiny skip in the core's pulse, the flaw, the break. The machine was hesitating, its systems overloaded with truth and conflicting orders. It was at its weakest point. As Quark dove. Hannah didn't try to hit him. She dropped to the floor and slammed the heel of her hand straight down onto the polished metal, right where she felt the vibration strongest. She didn't just hit it. She hit it in rhythm. Thrum, thrumdijum, thrum. She mimicked the core's exact unstable pulse, using the floor as a drum. For a moment, nothing happened. Quark's shadow fell over her. Then, the deep hum of the room changed. It stuttered. The blue light in the power conduit flared blindingly bright. The disintegrator above gave a piercing shriek and exploded in a shower of harmless crystal dust. A focused surge of raw power, confused and resonant, shot through the floor and up the conduit. It didn't explode. It focused into a tight, vibrating arc of energy that leaped from the conduit to the closest large, conductive object, Judge Quark's metal-tipped, swinging pincer. The energy traveled through him, seeking the path of least resistance. It found the joints of his shell, the spaces between the armored plates, which were perfectly tuned to the station's frequency. The resonant energy did not burn. It vibrated at a terrible, specific pitch. There was a sound like 100 stones being cracked at once. Quark's charge turned into a stiff, shuddering dance. His limbs jerked. The joints of his exoskeleton, shoulders, elbows, the gaps in his torso, fractured all at once with precise, brutal efficiency. His large central shell remained, but his limbs became disconnected, falling away from his body with clean, terrible breaks that he collapsed into a heap of disconnected shell and twitching flesh, his dark eyes wide with shock, before they went dark forever. The energy surge died. The room was silent except for the fading hum. Hannah was on her knees, breathing hard, her hand stinging from hitting the floor. The air smelled of ozone and something alien. Before her lay the butchered remains of the judge. She had not used a weapon. She had used a note, a frequency. She had made the station's own corrupted heart reject him. The guards stood frozen in horror. On the thousands of screens across the galaxy, the council delegates saw it all. They did not see a human girl fighting. They saw a system turning on its corrupt master. They saw the brutal, mechanical consequence of a lie introduced into a tuned machine. Hannah looked up from the judge to the camera. Her face was pale but calm. She had listened for the break, and she had found it. The silence in the execution chamber was heavy and complete. Hannah looked at her hands. They were empty. She had used a cup, a chip, and the floor. Now there was only the quiet hum of the station returning to its normal rhythm, and the terrible sight on the polished metal before her. The guards did not touch her. They stared at the remains of Judge Quark, then at the small human girl with something like fear. It was not fear of her strength, but fear of what she represented. She had not won a fight. She had performed a correction. The machine had rejected a faulty part. The spiraling door to the grand hall opened again. This time, Observer Yull entered, followed by a group of different guards in simpler uniforms, internal affairs. Yull's large eyes were wide, but he moved with a new authority. He went straight to Hannah, placing his soft-furred body between her and the other guards. "It is over," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The evidence has been seen. The council is in emergency session. You are not a prisoner. You are a witness." He offered a hand to help her up. Hannah took it, her own hand trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She stood on shaky legs. Guard Rail stepped forward. He had removed his helmet. His face was human-like, stern, but his eyes were on the power conduit. "The resonant surge," he said, more to himself than anyone. It was a system purge, a feedback loop along the fault line she identified. He looked at Hannah, and for the first time, his expression held a flicker of respect. You did not attack him. You made the station's own instability remove him. That was the truth they would all have to understand. They led her not back to a cell, but to a quiet, clean room with a window. It was a holding room for visiting diplomats. Outside the viewport, the stars shone steadily. A medical droid scanned her quickly, found no major injuries, and left. After a time, the door opened. Kim Min-soo stood there. He looked older, his face lined with worry and lack of sleep. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides and wrapped her in a tight hug. Hannah buried her face in his shoulder and finally let the tears come. They were quiet tears of relief, of fear that was now leaving her body. When she pulled back, he held her shoulders, looking her over. "Little engineer," he whispered. "You listened." "I heard the break," she said, her voice hoarse. He nodded. "And the whole galaxy heard it too." The process that followed was slow and complex. The Galactic Council, reeling from the public exposure of corruption and the shocking death of a high judge, moved carefully. Hannah gave her testimony many times. The data chip was verified. Observer Yul testified about how he came to possess it, from whistleblowers within the Xylos Energy Guild who feared Quark's power. The official ruling was that Judge Quark had corrupted his office and engineered Hannah's condemnation to hide his theft. His death was recorded as a fatal interaction with an unstable power system, resulting from his own unauthorized intrusion into a secured chamber. It was a dry, technical description. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. Everyone had seen what Hannah did, but no one could call it a crime. She had used no weapon but knowledge. She was given a full pardon. The record of her conviction was erased. On the day she was due to leave the station, Observer Yul visited her in the diplomatic room. "They are scared," he said simply. "Not of your fists, of your mind. They thought humans were loud and messy and weak. They did not understand that you listen to the universe in a way they have forgotten. You hear the song in the machine, and you know when the song is a lie." Hannah looked out at the stars. "What happens now?" "Now," Yul said, "they must reconsider everything. A human girl with no weapons exposed a corruption we were all too afraid to see. She did not break the system. She revealed it was already broken. That is a different kind of strength. It is one we must learn." Soon after, guardrail came to escort her to the transport shuttle. As they walked through the grand corridors, beings of many species stopped and watched her pass. Their looks were no longer of pity or contempt. They were of curiosity, of caution, of reevaluation. At the airlock leading to the human ship, Rail stopped. He handed her a small, flat object. It was a data slate. "The official technical readout of the incident," he said. "For your records. It includes the core's resonance frequency logs." It was an engineer's report, an acknowledgement of her method. "Thank you," Hannah said. He gave a stiff nod. "Your uncle is waiting. Go home, engineer." Hannah boarded the shuttle. Inside, Min-soo was already in the pilot's seat. The hatch closed, sealing out the cold, humming air of the station. The familiar sounds of a human ship greeted her. A different hum, a warmer, less perfect sound as the shuttle pulled away from the massive station. Min-soo looked over at her. "What are you thinking?" Hannah watched Eternum Lex shrink in the viewport, a glittering artificial star. She thought of the cold chamber, the deep hum, the feel of the floor under her hand. "They thought we were weak because we feel," she said quietly. "Because we cry and we get angry and we hope. They forgot that we also listen, and we build, and we fix what's broken." She turned to her uncle. "Even if it's a broken judge." Min-soo smiled a tired, proud smile. He engaged the thrusters, and the shuttle turned toward the distant blue dot of Earth. Behind them, across the galaxy, a story was already spreading. It was not a story of a bloody victory. It was a story of a girl, a note, and a truth that resonated. And the galaxy, for the first time, was listening. The air in the grand conclave chamber was cold enough to make Lee Hannah's skin prickle. She stood alone in a circle of harsh white light, surrounded by shadows that shifted and murmured. The shadows were the members of the Galactic Council, Dozens of different species gathered to watch her fate. To them, she looked like a small, pale ghost in a simple gray prisoner's suit. Hannah was 19. By human standards, she was of average height, but here she was smaller than almost everyone. Her black hair was tied back neatly, and her brown eyes were fixed on the raised platform in front of her. That was where Judge Kvork Saturday. Judge Kvork was a Zelen AR. He looked like a giant, walking crustacean the color of old blood. His body was covered in a thick, segmented shell. For arms ended in sharp pincers, and two large, dark eyes watched everything without blinking. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry click and rumble that came from speakers in the room. "Lee Hannah of Earth," the voice echoed. "You are charged with the willful destruction of a galactic heritage site, specifically the crystal core of Xylos. How do you answer?" Hannah took a small breath. She had practiced this. "I am not guilty. The core was already damaged when I found it." A wave of soft, alien sounds moved through the chamber. It might have been laughter or disgust. "The evidence suggests otherwise," Kvork clicked. A large holographic screen appeared above Hannah, showing security footage. It was blurry, but it showed a small figure, her, approaching the glowing crystal in the heart of the Xylos temple. Then the screen went static. "You were the only organic life form registered in the chamber for 6 standard hours before the core's failure. The energy signature of the collapse matches human-made tools found in your possession." "My tools were for measurement and study, not destruction," Hannah said, forcing her voice to stay level. "The Xylos caretakers can confirm I was invited for a research internship. I was documenting the core's energy patterns. It was flickering. I was trying to understand why. A primitive species, understanding a relic far beyond its comprehension," Judge Kvork said, his tone dismissing her entire race. "Humanity's history is one of reckless damage. You bring this chaos to the stars. Your very presence here is a testament to your race's emotional instability." Hannah felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. She thought of her uncle, Kim Min-soo, watching the broadcast from somewhere. She couldn't show anger. That would only prove their point. A new figure stood from the shadowy council benches. This was Observer Yul, a slender being with soft gray fur and large, kind eyes. "Honored Judge, if I may. The young human's records show exceptional scores in mechanical and energy systems. Her assertion of study is plausible. Could we not hear from the Xylos archivists?" "The Xylos archivists are non-corporeal energy beings," Kvork replied, not even looking at Yul. "Their testimony is unreliable. They do not understand the concept of guilt as we do. The physical evidence is clear. A thing of ancient beauty is gone, shattered into dust, and a human was there." He leaned forward, his large, dark eyes reflecting Hannah's tiny figure. "This is not merely about a crystal, Lee Hannah. This is about order. The Galactic Council operates on laws that have maintained peace for millennia. Younger races like yours must learn that some boundaries are absolute. Your species' tendency to act first and question later must be checked. For the preservation of all, a message must be sent." Hannah's heart began to pound against her ribs. What message? That such irreparable carelessness carries the ultimate price. The judge's pincers snapped together with a sound like breaking stone. "The council finds the accused, Lee Hannah of Earth, guilty of willful destruction of a galactic heritage site. The prescribed penalty is death by neural disintegration, to be carried out at the next cycle." The chamber erupted. The sounds were alien, but the feeling of shock was universal. Even some of the council members shifted uncomfortably. The death penalty was rare, reserved for warmongers and planetary destroyers, not a young intern. Hannah felt the cold air vanish, replaced by a sudden, suffocating heat. She swayed on her feet. "No, please. You're wrong. I didn't do it." Her plea was lost in the noise. 2 guards approached her. They were tall, armored, and silent. One was a cybernetically enhanced being she would come to know as Guardrail. His human-like face was impassive as he took her arm. His grip was firm, but not cruel. As they led her away from the light, Hannah looked back. Judge Kvork was already turning away, discussing something with an aide as if he had just ordered the disposal of a piece of trash. Observer Yull was still standing, his furry face etched with clear distress. The walk to the detention cell was a blur of polished metal corridors and alien stairs. The cell they placed her in was a smooth, rounded room. One wall was a clear energy field, humming softly. There was a bench, a sink, and nothing else. Alone, the strength left her legs. Hannah sat on the bench, pulling her knees to her chest. She was not a soldier or a hero. She was a girl who loved machines, who understood how things vibrated and resonated and fit together. She had come to the stars to learn, to see the wonders her parents had dreamed of before they disappeared. Now, she was condemned to die for a crime she didn't commit, by a creature who saw her entire species as a mistake. The fear was a cold stone in her stomach. But underneath it, something else began to burn. It was a small, quiet flame, fed by injustice. It was the memory of her uncle's voice, teaching her to listen to the heartbeat of a failing engine, to find the weak point, the truth hidden in the noise. She looked at the energy field on her cell wall. It hummed at a specific frequency. She could almost feel it in her teeth. It was a sound, a vibration, and Hannah, trapped and condemned, began to listen.